Mansfield, Texas, is the kind of place people dream of calling home. Perfectly trimmed lawns, clean air, and a serenity that wraps around the neighborhood like a comforting blanket. Among these picturesque homes stood one that many admired, the two-story residence of the Wamsley family. Its manicured front yard, carefully pruned hedges, and sparkling lights during the holiday season made it the pride of the street. Rick and Susan Wamsley were the embodiment of the American dream. High school sweethearts from Oklahoma, their story was one of love, hard work, and shared aspirations. Rick, driven and meticulous, had risen to success as an accountant in the competitive oil and gas industry. Susan, a devoted wife and mother, was the emotional cornerstone of the family. The Wamsleys seemed to have it all: financial security, a warm and inviting home, and two children who were the pride of their lives: Sarah, the accomplished and diligent eldest daughter, and Andrew, the beloved younger son who showed great promise. But as we often learn, appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface of this perfect portrait were subtle cracks, signs of tension and conflict that only those within the family could feel. These small fractures, though seemingly harmless at first, would widen over time, setting the stage for a tragedy no one could have foreseen. At the center of these tensions was Andrew, 19 years old at the time. He was at a crossroads in his life, struggling under the weight of his parents' expectations. A young man with dreams of his own, Andrew's aspirations clashed with the carefully laid plans Rick and Susan had envisioned for him. The disagreements started small but began to escalate, like a spark growing into an uncontainable fire. Rick and Susan insisted that Andrew stay in college, a condition tied to the financial support they provided him. But Andrew had dropped out, leaving Rick deeply disappointed. This disappointment was further compounded by Andrew's relationship with Chelsea Richardson, a young woman Rick and Susan couldn't approve of. To Andrew, Chelsea was everything he needed: someone who understood him, supported him, and provided solace from the pressure at home. But to Rick and Susan, Chelsea was the embodiment of trouble. They saw her as someone whose background and lifestyle clashed with the Wamsley family's values. This disapproval only deepened Andrew's resentment toward his parents. Disagreements between parents and children are natural, but what made this situation unusual was how these tensions were allowed to fester and escalate. The small cracks in their family dynamic widened into unbridgeable gaps. And in those gaps, Andrew began harboring thoughts that no one could have imagined. The events leading to the Wamsley family's tragedy would soon unfold, leaving behind lessons of betrayal, greed, and the fragile nature of relationships that seem unbreakable. It was the night of December 11, 2003, and like any other Thursday evening, the Wamsley family's home appeared to be filled with the warmth of holiday cheer. Christmas lights flickered outside, casting a soft glow that illuminated the calm street. Inside, everything seemed serene, and yet the quiet was deceptive. Within these walls, a storm was brewing, one that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. As the evening wore on, there was no indication that this would be the night that the Wamsley family's picture-perfect existence would shatter. The usual sounds of suburban life, a dog barking in the distance, the hum of a passing car, filled the air. But the tranquility was about to be pierced by an event that would stun the community. At 11:45 p.m., an unsettling 911 call came through. An open line call. The dispatcher's initial attempts to communicate were met with nothing but static, punctuated only by heavy, labored breathing. At first, it seemed like a mistake, but as the seconds ticked by, the dispatcher realized something was terribly wrong. The phone line remained open for nearly a full minute, each breath more panicked than the last. It was a cry for help, though no words were spoken. The terror in the silence was palpable. The officers arrived at the scene within minutes, their lights flashing against the cold, dark sky. They rushed inside, hoping to find some answers, but what they encountered was beyond anything they could have prepared for. What they found was horrific. Rick and Susan Wamsley, the seemingly perfect couple, lay motionless in their bedroom. Their bodies were a brutal testament to the violence that had unfolded within those walls. Both Rick and Susan had been shot, but the brutality didn't stop there. Each had suffered multiple stab wounds. It was an act of rage, a cold and calculated violence that left no doubt in the officers' minds that this was no random attack. As investigators began to piece together the crime, they quickly realized that this was not a simple robbery gone wrong. Key pieces of evidence told a different story. $115,000 in cash sat untouched in the master bedroom, untouched by the killer's hand. The lack of a clear motive made the crime even more perplexing. Was this a personal vendetta? Or was there something more sinister at play? The investigators found that Rick had struggled before his death. A tuft of his hair was clutched tightly in his hand, as if he had fought back with every ounce of strength. There were palm prints left behind, smeared in blood, as if someone had tried to flee the scene in a panic. It was clear this was no ordinary crime. There had been a violent struggle in the moments before Rick and Susan's lives were tragically cut short. At first, the investigation pointed to a botched robbery. But as detectives delved deeper, they realized that the Wamsley family's life was far more complicated than it seemed. The picture-perfect image of Rick and Susan was slowly unraveling, revealing the deep cracks in their family dynamic. Andrew, who had been asleep in his room when the crime occurred, was questioned along with Chelsea Richardson, his girlfriend. Their alibis seemed solid. Both were accounted for during the time of the murders. But the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They couldn't ignore the growing sense that Andrew might not be as innocent as he appeared. As the investigation continued, the detectives began to uncover a series of texts and phone calls between Andrew and Chelsea, some of which raised more questions than answers. Were they just a young couple dealing with family pressure, or was there something darker at play? The investigation was just beginning, but the answers were proving more elusive than ever. On that cold December night, Mansfield, Texas, was forever changed. The Wamsley family's tragedy would soon become one of the most talked about cases in the region, a case that would reveal just how far betrayal and resentment could push those who seemed to have everything. The investigation had just begun, and the detectives were about to uncover truths more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The morning after the murders, Mansfield woke up to the kind of shock that reverberates through a community's very soul. A tragedy had struck in the most unexpected of places, the home of the Wamsleys, a family that, from the outside, seemed perfect. But as investigators began to dig deeper, the glossy surface of their idyllic life began to crack, revealing a web of unresolved tension, unspoken resentments, and secrets that had been festering for years. Andrew Wamsley, the youngest of the two children, was once seen as the golden boy, bright, promising, and full of potential. He had been the apple of his parents' eyes, the child who could do no wrong. But as he entered adulthood, something began to shift. Andrew, once eager to live up to his parents' expectations, began to pull away. The pressure that had once fueled him now seemed to suffocate him. Andrew's decision to drop out of college in 2003 was the first of many cracks in the family's foundation. Rick and Susan had worked hard to provide Andrew with the opportunities they never had, and they expected him to follow a path that mirrored their own: successful, stable, and respectable. But Andrew, yearning for freedom and independence, rebelled. He wanted a life of his own, one not dictated by the plans of his parents. Rick, ever the pragmatic one, had a clear vision for his son's future. He tried to keep Andrew on track, even when it became clear that Andrew was drifting further away. Susan, on the other hand, found herself caught in the middle, wanting to maintain the family's harmony while also supporting her son. But the strain of trying to please everyone was taking its toll on her. She was beginning to realize that the perfect family she had worked so hard to create was unraveling right before her eyes. Conversations around the dinner table became increasingly strained. Small talk became a chore, and the once tight-knit family dynamic began to deteriorate. Every attempt to discuss Andrew's future, his relationship with Chelsea, and his life choices felt like an attack. As the weeks went by, the divide between Andrew and his parents grew wider, and no one knew how to fix it. And then there was Chelsea, a young woman whom Rick and Susan could never understand. Chelsea, with her free spirit and rebellious attitude, was everything that Rick and Susan disapproved of. To them, she represented everything they had worked to distance their family from: chaos, uncertainty, and unpredictability. They feared that Chelsea was a bad influence on Andrew, and their disapproval only deepened the wedge between them. To Andrew, Chelsea was an escape, a chance to be with someone who didn't expect him to live up to the impossible standards set by his parents. In Chelsea, Andrew found someone who understood his frustrations, his desires, and his dreams. But to Rick and Susan, Chelsea was the enemy, and their disdain for her only fueled Andrew's rebelliousness. Behind closed doors, Rick and Susan tried to discuss their growing concerns about Andrew and Chelsea. They feared that Andrew was making choices that would ruin his future. But their attempts to intervene were met with resistance. Andrew became more secretive, more withdrawn. And the more they tried to control him, the more he pushed back. The tension between Andrew and his parents reached a boiling point when Rick and Susan began to demand that Andrew end his relationship with Chelsea. It was clear to them that Andrew's choices were becoming more reckless, and they feared he was heading down a dangerous path. But Andrew, unwilling to be controlled, rebelled even harder. To him, Chelsea was the only person who truly understood him. She was the only one who didn't judge him, who accepted him for who he was. And so, their relationship deepened, even as his parents' disapproval grew. Despite all of this, Rick and Susan still loved Andrew deeply. Their disappointment was not rooted in hatred, but in concern. They wanted what was best for him. But in the end, their well-meaning efforts only pushed him further away. And as the months passed, their once harmonious family began to disintegrate, leaving behind a broken shell of what it once was. On December 11, 2003, the Wamsley family reached its breaking point. The fractures in their relationships, the simmering tensions, and the unresolved issues finally collided in the most tragic of ways. But what no one could have predicted was that the source of this heartbreak, the catalyst for the family's destruction, lay closer to home than anyone could have imagined. Once again, the Wamsley family was confronted with a reality they could never have anticipated. The questions that had been building about Andrew, about Chelsea, about the future would soon be answered, but not in the way anyone hoped. The investigation into the Wamsley family murders began like any other, methodical, organized, and driven by the need for justice. Detectives followed the usual protocols, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and piecing together a timeline of events. But as the hours turned into days, and the investigation deepened, it became clear that this was no ordinary case. What seemed at first to be an act of senseless violence was beginning to reveal an intricate and unsettling truth, a truth that no one, not even the seasoned detectives, could have expected. On the night of the murders, the Wamsley family home became the scene of a brutal crime, a double homicide so violent that it left investigators speechless. When the 911 call was first made, it seemed like the kind of call detectives had received countless times before. But this one was different. The line was open, yet no one spoke. The chilling silence from the other end of the phone was enough to raise alarms, and officers rushed to the Wamsley residence. When the officers arrived, they were met with a scene of unimaginable violence. Rick and Susan Wamsley lay dead in their home, victims of not just gunshot wounds but multiple stab wounds. The brutality of the attack was shocking, but what made the crime even more disturbing was the lack of a clear motive. The scene was not one of a random robbery gone wrong. There was no sign of forced entry, and valuable items, including $115,000 in cash found in the master bedroom, remained untouched. What kind of killer would leave behind such a fortune without taking a single penny? As detectives sifted through the evidence, one thing became painfully clear: this wasn't a typical crime. The level of violence, the signs of a struggle, the broken hair clip, the bloody palm prints, they all pointed to something far more personal. The murder of Rick and Susan Wamsley wasn't the result of an anonymous attack. It was an act of someone who knew them intimately, someone who had been close enough to cause this kind of destruction. At first, the investigators considered the possibility of a botched robbery or an outsider looking for money. But that theory quickly unraveled. The cash found in the master bedroom made it clear that theft was not the motive. What's more, the physical evidence, blood, fingerprints, and hair, began to paint a clearer picture of what had really happened. Whoever was behind this was no stranger to the Wamsleys. No, this was personal. As detectives dug deeper, they began to focus their attention on the people closest to the victims. Andrew, the troubled son who had dropped out of college and become increasingly distant, was one of the first to come under scrutiny. His volatile relationship with his parents, his rebellious behavior, and his strained relationship with Chelsea were all red flags. But even with these apparent signs, Andrew and Chelsea's alibis seemed airtight. Both of them claimed to have been together at Chelsea's apartment during the time of the murders. There was no immediate evidence to suggest their involvement. While Andrew and Chelsea had convinced the police that they were not involved, the detectives were not ready to rule them out. Their investigation revealed that Andrew had become more secretive in the weeks leading up to the murders. He had stopped communicating with his parents, choosing instead to spend more time with Chelsea and her best friend, Susanna Toledano. It was this new connection that would ultimately lead investigators to the truth. Susanna Toledano, Chelsea's best friend, was the breakthrough the investigators had been waiting for. Initially, Susanna maintained her innocence, claiming that she had no knowledge of the murders. But as the pressure mounted, and the evidence stacked against her, Susanna began to crack. She admitted to her involvement in the plan to kill Rick and Susan Wamsley, revealing a chilling and calculated plot orchestrated by Andrew and Chelsea. What started as a series of conversations between friends about a perfect crime soon escalated into something far darker. Andrew, frustrated by his parents' refusal to give him the life he thought he deserved, had come up with a plan. He would kill his parents, inherit their wealth, and finally live the life he had always wanted. Chelsea, eager to please Andrew and fueled by her own resentment of the Wamsleys, went along with the plan. And Susanna, swept up in the excitement of their scheme, became an unwitting accomplice. The investigation that had started as a routine case of double homicide had turned into something far more sinister. A crime of passion, yes, but also one of calculation, planning, and a complete breakdown of the Wamsley family's once perfect facade. And as detectives pieced together the truth, they realized that the Wamsleys' tragedy was not just the result of a violent act but of years of simmering resentment, manipulation, and greed. What followed was a series of confessions, each piece of the puzzle falling into place. The shocking truth behind the Wamsley family's destruction had been exposed, and the detectives had finally unraveled the tangled web of lies, deceit, and murder. But as the investigation drew to a close, the community of Mansfield was left to grapple with the reality of what had happened. A family torn apart by greed, betrayal, and a desire for a future that could never have been theirs. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the truth of what had transpired inside the Wamsley home that fateful December night became undeniable. What had once seemed like a senseless and random act of violence, a brutal murder that defied explanation, had revealed itself as a calculated, carefully planned crime. And the perpetrators were not strangers but people who had once been trusted members of the Wamsley family's closest circle. Andrew's confession was chilling. As he sat across from detectives, his once confident demeanor had faltered. Gone was the rebellious young man who had flaunted his discontent with his parents. Now, he was a man stripped of illusions, confronting the consequences of his actions. He admitted to orchestrating the murders of Rick and Susan Wamsley, the very parents who had once supported him, provided for him, and given him every opportunity. He spoke of his growing resentment, his frustration with their refusal to give him the life he believed he deserved. Andrew had always struggled with his sense of entitlement. His parents' demands that he attend college, that he work hard to make his own way had felt like insurmountable obstacles to him. In his mind, he was capable of far more than what his parents believed, and when they refused to give him the freedom to live the life he imagined, resentment began to grow. The promise of inheritance became his fixation, the way he could escape what he saw as the confines of his parents' expectations. Andrew's relationship with Chelsea had only intensified the sense of entitlement. Chelsea, too, had her reasons for disliking the Wamsleys. Her background was a far cry from the wealth and privilege of the Wamsley family, and she felt she was looked down upon. But she had fallen deeply in love with Andrew, and his frustrations became hers. Together, they nurtured a dangerous idea: they could have it all, the wealth, the freedom, the life they had always wanted, if only Rick and Susan were out of the picture. At first, Chelsea's involvement was subtle, her objections soft but present. But as time went on, she was drawn deeper into the scheme. Together with Andrew, she began to orchestrate the murder of Rick and Susan Wamsley. Their plan was chilling in its simplicity: a violent, swift attack to eliminate the obstacle to their future. Susan, Chelsea's best friend, had been drawn into their web. Though she hadn't been the mastermind, her role was crucial. She had been complicit in helping to plan the crime, even practicing shooting a gun to ensure that everything would go according to their plan. But in the end, it wasn't just about the thrill of the crime, it was about the money. The promise of wealth, the lure of a life of luxury, was enough to cloud their judgment. The crime had been coldly calculated, an act of cruelty masked by years of manipulation and resentment. As the truth emerged, so did the ugly reality of the Wamsley family's destruction. What had once been a home filled with love, laughter, and promise had been reduced to a crime scene, its walls forever stained by betrayal and greed. The final revelation was horrifying. The Wamsley family was not torn apart by an outside force, but by the very people who had been closest to them, their own flesh and blood. The murders of Rick and Susan Wamsley were not the result of some random act of violence. They were the product of deep-seated anger, the culmination of years of simmering resentment, and the seductive allure of wealth. As the trial progressed, the shock of the community grew. How could this have happened? How could Andrew, a son who had once been loved, trusted, and nurtured, turn so violently against his own parents? How could Chelsea, a young woman with so much potential, choose this dark path? How could Susanna, a friend who had once been close to both families, become complicit in this horrific act? In the end, justice was served. Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna were convicted of the murders of Rick and Susan Wamsley. They were sentenced to life in prison, the harshest penalty for a crime that had stolen not only the lives of two people but also the lives of the perpetrators, who had once known love and family. Their futures were forever changed, a stark reminder that no amount of wealth or privilege could protect them from the consequences of their actions. The Wamsley family tragedy serves as a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving. No matter how perfect a life may seem from the outside, beneath the surface, darkness can lurk. And in the end, it is the choices we make, the lies we tell, the grudges we harbor, the betrayals we commit that shape our destiny. The Wamsleys' tragedy is a lesson for us all, that even the brightest dreams can crumble under the weight of greed, envy, and a fractured trust. The shocking murders of Rick and Susan Wamsley left a scar on the community of Mansfield that would never fully heal. The neighborhood, once bustling with the warm, familiar sounds of family life, was forever altered. The Wamsleys had been a well-known and respected family, admired for their success and their apparent happiness. But after the crime, the town was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: the illusion of the perfect family had been just that, an illusion. For many, the news of the murders was impossible to comprehend. The Wamsley family had been seen as the embodiment of the American dream. Rick, a successful accountant, had worked hard to provide a comfortable life for his family. Susan, a devoted mother and wife, had created a warm and loving home. Their children, Andrew and Sarah, were seen as the next generation of success, young people with bright futures ahead of them. But now, with the murder of both parents, everything had changed. The aftermath of the Wamsley tragedy wasn't just felt by those closest to the family. The entire town of Mansfield felt the ripples of the crime, a quiet community shaken to its core by the brutal betrayal. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers, all of whom had believed in the Wamsleys' picture-perfect life, were left asking one painful question: how could this happen? Grief and confusion enveloped the community, but so did questions. How could someone like Andrew, a young man with so much potential, have turned into a cold-hearted killer? How could Chelsea, a girl who had been close to Susan, have helped him bring about the deaths of the very people who had trusted her? And what of Susanna, the best friend of Chelsea? How could she have turned her back on the Wamsley family and played such a critical role in the crime? Despite the horror of the crime, Mansfield, Texas, had to rebuild. The wounds, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. The Wamsley family had left an indelible mark on the town, but the truth behind their deaths forced the community to confront uncomfortable realities. No family is immune to conflict. No household is free from the pressures of life. The Wamsley family, once a symbol of success and happiness, had fallen victim to the destructive forces of greed, betrayal, and resentment. For the investigators who worked the case, the Wamsley tragedy had become a haunting puzzle, one that tested their skills and their ability to uncover the truth. Detective Sergeant Williams, in particular, found himself confronting a deep sense of disbelief. How could a son, who had been so loved and supported, do something so horrific? And how could someone so close to the family, Chelsea, who had once shared dinners at their table, laughed with them, and even cried with them, become an accomplice to murder? As the trial of Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna begins, the town's collective grief turns into something else, a thirst for justice. The truth, however painful, must be revealed. The people of Mansfield wanted closure, but more than that, they wanted to understand how such a thing could have happened in their quiet town. In the end, justice was served, but the scars would remain. The convictions of Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna brought closure to the Wamsley family's loved ones, but no verdict could undo the tragedy that had forever altered their lives. The Wamsley tragedy serves as a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how fragile the bonds of family can be. It shows us that even those closest to us, the people we love and trust the most, can harbor dark secrets. In the end, it is not just about the crime itself, it is about the choices that led to it, the betrayals that set the stage, and the consequences that followed. The Wamsley family's story is one of tragedy, but also one of warning. We must never take for granted the relationships that shape our lives, for sometimes, even the closest bonds can be broken beyond repair. As the years have passed since the brutal murders of Rick and Susan Wamsley, Mansfield, Texas, has slowly begun to heal. The town, once rocked by shock and disbelief, now carries the heavy weight of the Wamsley tragedy as part of its history. But with time comes understanding, and with understanding, comes the hope for change. The pain of loss may never fully fade, but the Wamsley tragedy has sparked important conversations about the fragility of family relationships, the toxic power of resentment, and the dangers of unchecked greed. In the years that followed the crime, the residents of Mansfield have come to realize the importance of empathy, communication, and the need to nurture the bonds that hold families together. One of the most significant changes in Mansfield since the Wamsley tragedy has been the increased focus on family counseling and support services. Local organizations now offer programs to help families address conflict before it escalates to violence. These programs emphasize the importance of open dialogue, mutual respect, and recognizing when things are not as they seem. The tragedy of Rick and Susan Wamsley may have taken their lives, but it sparked something important in the people who knew them: the realization that family dynamics, no matter how perfect they seem on the surface, can hide deep-seated issues. The Wamsleys' fall from grace has taught the community a hard lesson about the dangers of neglecting emotional well-being in the name of success or appearances. Through conversations like these, Mansfield has begun to shift its focus from a quiet community of pretense to one that values honesty, connection, and vulnerability. People have begun to open up about the difficulties they face at home, whether it's conflict between parents and children, financial pressures, or the struggles of maintaining a work-life balance. The Wamsleys, in their tragic end, have inadvertently sparked a movement, one that seeks to heal the hidden wounds that fester beneath the surface. For those who once lived in the Wamsley home, the memory of that night is impossible to escape. While the physical structure may have crumbled, the emotional scars left by the murders of Rick and Susan remain, both for the family and the community. However, through the tragedy, a vital lesson has been imparted, that no matter how beautiful or successful a life may appear from the outside, the true health of a family lies in the emotional bonds that are nurtured and protected within the walls of the home. As the years go by, the Wamsley tragedy remains a reminder of the consequences that come from neglecting the emotional health of a family. But it is also a reminder that it is never too late to change, to open up, and to make the necessary adjustments before it is too late. The pain and grief will always be a part of Mansfield's history, but it is no longer a place where people are afraid to speak about their struggles or seek help. The legacy of the Wamsley family will never be forgotten, but it is no longer solely defined by tragedy. In time, it has become a story of resilience, of a community coming together to heal, to learn, and to grow. The lessons learned from Rick and Susan's deaths have changed Mansfield, for better or for worse. And though their names will always carry the weight of what happened, their deaths have ultimately led to a more open, connected, and compassionate community. As we reflect on the Wamsley family tragedy, we are reminded that, ultimately, no family is perfect. But with love, understanding, and support, families can survive even the darkest of times. In the end, it's not the perfection that matters, but the ability to heal, to forgive, and to find strength in one another. For Mansfield, and for those who knew Rick and Susan, the hope is that the lessons learned will last long after the pain has subsided. If you found this story impactful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you more in-depth and thought-provoking stories. Share this video with friends and family, and join our community as we explore the untold stories that shape our world. Together, let's keep learning, reflecting, and growing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.